What's up, ladies and gentlemen of the internet? How are you guys doing? My name is Matt LeGrand, and one thing I've noticed is that cyclists are obsessed with talking about gears, gear selection, using terms like compact crank, or referring to their cassette size like 1128, 1125. And in this video, we're going to simplify all of that stuff. We're going to talk about a little bit of terminology, and by the end of this video, you'll be all set with all of the knowledge that you need to make your gearing selection, to make your bike ride or your race, or maybe even like a general touring expedition so much easier. Okay, just so we're on the same page, let's just quickly go over a little bit of terminology. If we take a look at my bike, I use a bike called the Trek Speed Concept, and it looks like this. And for the most part, I think the only things that we're really gonna need to talk about are the front chainring, the rear cassette, maybe the chain itself, but for the most part, not too much difficult terminology here. Okay, so let's just dig into it. Let's take a look at a single wheel. And if we were to take our single wheel and measure the distance that the wheel and the bike would travel, like with one revolution, you could use this by just kind of looking at where the valve stem is and dropping a tape measure and just actually rolling your bike. Just one revolution of the wheel, you might get a number like 7 feet, what is that, 2 meters, depending on the size of the tire that you have, tire pressure and things like that. So if we introduce our front chainring and we adjust the size so that the front chainring and the rear cassette are the same sizes, then we know that for every pedal revolution, our bike is gonna travel about 7 feet or 2 meters. Now, that's pretty low gearing. So if we double our front chainring and keep our rear cassette the same, then every time that we actually revolve our pedal, our bike is now traveling twice the distance. In this case, it would be like 14 feet or 4 meters, something along those lines. And this is something that you guys have probably all noticed while riding your bike. If you increase the size of your front gearing by shifting, assuming that you have like 2 chain rings up front, you can go faster. And if you decrease the size of your rear cassette by shifting, you can also go faster. Conversely, if you lower the size of your front chainring and increase the size of your rear cassette, it gets much, much easier to climb hills. Okay, so it's common to estimate chainring size by counting its teeth. Teeth are just those little pointy parts of the chainring or the cassette, and it's fairly common to have 2 chainrings attached to the front crank. And some common chainring sizes might be like a 53 tooth chainring in the front, right behind that maybe a 39 tooth chainring, and they would just call that whole thing like a standard crank. Other common sizes would be like a 50 tooth chainring and then 36 behind that, and they actually call that like a semi-compact crank. And then what I've noticed is actually really popular recently is like a 50 tooth chainring and a 34 behind that, and they call that a compact crank, which just makes climbing just a little bit easier. But not all bikes have 2 chain rings up front. Some bikes will have a 3rd chain ring in the front, and it's often referred to as like having a triple. And if you have a triple, that's awesome. You're carrying around that extra chainring. Seems like you might as well use it on some of those killer climbs. Definitely don't be one of those people that has a triple, they're bringing it around, but they never use it. And while 2 chainrings seems the most common, I've also noticed that athletes are kind of gravitating towards 1 chainring in the front. Sometimes people will call that a 1-by system, which might seem crazy to some of you guys, but I think when we start calculating, actually how far your bike travels for each gear combination, we might notice that there is a lot of overlap. My bike has an 11-speed cassette. When you have an 11-speed cassette, they often refer to it as an 11-speed bike. A lot of times you'll have, an 8-speed, 9-speed, 10-speed cassette. They're just often referred to as 8, 9, 10-speed bikes. But even if you have 2 in the front, they're still referred to as 11-speed bikes. But just know that if you have 2 chain rings in the front, an 11-speed cassette in the back, you'd have a result of 22 different gear combination, which is pretty common, and it's personally what I have on my bike. And here's where I think things get kind of interesting. Having 22 different gear combinations doesn't actually mean that you have 22 different gear ratios. And by gear ratios, we're kind of talking about how far the bike's gonna travel with each pedal rotation. Okay, so if I'm in my big chain ring in the front and my smallest ring in my back cassette, for me, that's a 53 tooth chain ring in the front and an 11 tooth in the back. That's almost 5 times difference, which means each time I rotate my pedal, my rear wheel is rotating almost 5 times. And we can calculate that exact distance by using a formula like this. And in this case, with each pedal rotation, I'm traveling forward 405 inches. When I move up the cassette and I'm still using a 53 in the front and the 12 tooth ring in the back, each rotation results in 371 inches of forward movement. And then using our smallest chainring and our largest rear cassette option results in like a 3928, and that'll give us 117 inches of forward travel. So in our lowest gearing, our gear ratio gets kind of like close to 1 there. Not exactly 1, it's probably closer to like 1.5. So if we take a quick look at this chart that we made, what you'll notice and what you'll start to see is there's actually a fair amount of overlap. And if we start to eliminate some of the overlap, what you might notice is that in this case, what I see is that there's really only about 15 true gear combinations, as long as we're willing to kind of like round to about 1 or 2 inches. And some of these gear combinations result in the chain having to conform to a bit of a weird diagonal angle. And this is often referred to as cross-chaining your bike. And it's something that I'd probably recommend that you guys avoid if you can help it. And that's for 2 reasons. One is that cross-chaining will result in a lot more wear and tear on your bike components. It's a little bit harder on the teeth of your chain rings and your cassette, so those will wear out a little bit faster. It's also a little bit more difficult on the chain itself, and it'll kind of cause your chain to stretch a little prematurely. And the second reason to avoid cross-chaining, and just to kind of keep your chain as straight as possible, is that it'll result in a lot more efficient power transfer into the bike. On this channel, we are always talking about like free speed, and ways to kind of make your bike go faster as easy as possible. And keeping your chain straight and under tension is actually a lot faster. So take, for example, cross-chaining and having your front chainring a 39, in the rear cassette and an 11, that actual gearing is almost exactly the same as using the 5315, except for the fact that your chain is gonna be significantly straighter. And actually straightening out your chain can save you as much as 1 to 3 watts of power, so it's definitely worth taking advantage of. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about common chainring sizes, but I wanted to quickly go over cassette sizes, because this is what I'll typically change based on like whatever race I'm doing or potentially like whatever ride I'm worried about. So for a flat course, you might want to use a cassette that has a smaller range. I have an 1125 cassette that I typically use for really flat races, and it's still an 11-speed cassette, it just has less jumps in between each gear. And a common term for cassettes that goes up 1 tooth for each gear is called like a straight block. I've also heard them called like a corncob cassette. So if you guys hear that, you'll know what that means. An example of something like that might be like an 1121 10-speed cassette, but I haven't seen them as much lately, and I just don't think that they're as common as they used to be. And one point that I really want to drive home is just that changing cassettes really isn't that difficult, and it really can make a world of difference for your race or your particular bike ride. For example, the first race of the year that I'll do for this year's triathlon season is really like pancake flat. I don't think I'll really need to change gears much at all. Once I kind of get up and rolling, I might like have one gear going one direction with the wind and maybe like a slightly different gear when the wind is on my back. And I'll use that 1125, and it should be pretty easy for me to find a gear that should work pretty well for that particular ride. Whereas the second race of my triathlon season is completely different. I know that there's gonna be a fairly large amount of climbing. The race takes place just outside of Bend, Oregon, close to Mount Bachelor, through the Deschutes National Forest. I'll probably switch my cassette from the 1125 over either to an 1128. I might actually even use an 1130 for that particular race because it's just a lot of climbing. And I know that the extra gearing will be extremely helpful. And I think that most people would consider anything kind of over that 1127 or 1128 tooth cassette to really be like a climbing cassette, but it really will help if you guys are having trouble climbing. And changing cassettes really isn't that hard. It might take you like 15 or 20 minutes, and they're really not that expensive to have a couple of different options. I would look to spend, somewhere around like 50 bucks, just depending on what type of cassette that you're buying. And I'll try to leave a link to a couple of different options down below in the description of this video, as well as some tools that you might need to change your cassette, but definitely consider picking up a couple of cassettes. And if you found this video helpful, or you're just into swimming, biking, or running, consider subscribing below. There's a little subscribe button. There's also a little notification bell, and that just allows you to be notified of whenever I post new videos. And I'm trying to post new videos about once per week. All right, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope it was helpful, and we will see you guys in the next one.